They offered her gold for her silence. But by sundown it was the richest man in Dry Creek who couldn't speak a single word. Before we go further, listen close, because stories like this don't shout. They settle in your bones slow, like dust on a long road, and they don't leave easy. Dry Creek was the kind of town where the sun baked the truth right out of people, where boards creaked under boots and every window watched, but never spoke. And in that silence, men like Caleb Whitmore grew powerful, not by strength, but by knowing exactly how much a person's fear was worth. Caleb rode in that morning like he owned the horizon itself, boots polished, coat clean despite 50 miles of road behind him, his horse stepping high like it knew its rider never lost, never waited, never asked twice. Folks stepped aside without being told, hats tipping just enough to show respect, or maybe just habit, because around here, money talked louder than any preacher on a Sunday. But there was one door that didn't open when he passed, one porch that didn't creak under curiosity, and it belonged to Eleanor Hayes. Her house sat at the edge of town like it had been forgotten on purpose, wood worn gray by years of wind, a single rocking chair unmoving in the shade, and a window that caught the light just enough to show someone inside, watching, waiting, or maybe just refusing to disappear. Eleanor had buried her husband 6 months ago. No ceremony worth remembering, no answers worth keeping, just a quiet hole in the ground and a silence that stretched longer than the road out of town. People said it was an accident down at the mine, said it with quick mouths and faster eyes, like saying it twice made it true, but Eleanor never repeated it, never agreed, never argued, just carried that silence like something heavy and sharp. Caleb didn't knock when he reached her door, just pushed it open like it already belonged to him, stepping inside with the smell of leather and dust following close behind, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to shrink around him, like even the walls knew better than to stand in his way. Eleanor sat at the table, hands folded, eyes steady, not surprised, not afraid, just there, like she had been expecting this exact moment since the day the ground closed over her husband. Caleb reached into his coat and set a small leather pouch on the table, the kind that didn't need to be opened to know what was inside, coins shifting with a dull weight that carried more meaning than most words ever could. "You've been quiet," he said, voice smooth, measured, the kind that made people nod before they understood why. Eleanor didn't answer, didn't move, just looked at the pouch, then at him, like she was measuring something that had nothing to do with money. "Keep it that way," he added, tapping the leather lightly, like sealing a deal that had already been decided. Outside, the wind brushed against the house, soft, almost careful, and somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter knocked once, then again, like a clock counting down to something no one else could hear. Eleanor finally moved, slow, deliberate, reaching not for the gold, but for something tucked beneath the table, and when she brought it up into the light, Caleb's hand stopped midair, his breath catching just enough to betray him, because what she placed between them wasn't worth $1 in any market, but it carried a weight that no man could ever buy his way out of. Caleb did not touch the object at first, not because he did not recognize it, but because he did, and that recognition settled in his chest like something heavy and unwelcome, the kind of weight a man carries when he knows a moment has slipped beyond his control. The watch lay open between them, its silver dulled by time, its hinge bent just enough to show it had been forced once, maybe twice, and inside the lid, where no one would look unless they had reason to, a dark stain clung to the metal, faint but stubborn, like it refused to be forgotten. Eleanor's fingers rested lightly on the table, not guarding the watch, not offering it either, just letting it exist there in the space between them, a quiet truth that did not need explaining. "You found that in the mine?" Caleb asked, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, like it was reaching for something that no longer answered. Eleanor shook her head. "Once slow, steady. He carried it every day," she said, her voice calm, almost distant, as if she had repeated those words many times before, just not out loud. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, and the faint creak of the floorboards under Caleb's boots sounded louder than it should have, each shift of his weight echoing like a reminder that he was still standing there, still part of something he had hoped to settle quickly and leave behind. Outside, a wagon rolled past, wheels grinding against the dry dirt, the sound dragging slowly across the silence before fading into the distance. leaving nothing but the soft whistle of wind through the cracks in the wood. Caleb glanced toward the door, just for a second, like a man measuring the distance to an exit he might need sooner than expected, then back to the watch, then to Eleanor. "Accidents happen," he said, and the words came out practiced, worn smooth from use, the kind of sentence that had ended many conversations before they ever truly began. Eleanor did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply reached out and turned the watch slightly, angling it so the light from the window struck the inside just right, revealing more than the stain, revealing a faint line scratched into the metal beneath it, letters carved by a hand that had not been steady but had been determined. Caleb's eyes narrowed, leaning closer without meaning to, reading the uneven marks that spelled out a single word, a name, not his, but close enough to tighten something behind his ribs. He straightened slowly, his jaw setting, but not in the same way as before, not with confidence, more like a man bracing against a truth he could not push aside. "That does not prove anything," he said, though he did not look at her when he said it. Eleanor's gaze never left him. "It proves he had time," she replied quietly. "Time to know." The words hung there, simple, but they shifted the room in a way no amount of gold ever could, turning something unseen into something that could not be ignored. Caleb reached for the pouch then, almost out of instinct, sliding it a few inches closer to her, the coins inside giving a soft, hollow sound as they moved, but the gesture felt different now, smaller, like he was offering something that had already lost its value. "Take it," he said, and there was a trace of urgency beneath the surface now, a crack where certainty used to be. "You do not need to make this harder than it has to be." Eleanor looked at the pouch, then back at him, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that shifted, not fear, not anger, something steadier than both. She pushed the pouch back across the table, slow enough that he could have stopped it if he wanted to, but he did not. The leather slid to a quiet stop near his hand, untouched, unwanted. "It is already as hard as it can be," she said. And in that moment, with the gold returned and the watch still open between them, Caleb Whitmore realized that whatever he had come here to finish had only just begun. The pouch stayed where she had pushed it, close enough for Caleb to take back without reaching far, but far enough to remind him it had been refused, and in Dry Creek, refusal carried a weight most men avoided at any cost. He let his hand rest near it without touching it, fingers stiff, as if the leather itself had turned cold, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching until it filled every corner of the room. Then Caleb exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, trying to gather something of the control he had walked in with, but it slipped through him like dry sand. "You think a name scratched in metal changes anything," he said, quieter now, not for her, but for himself, like he needed to hear the words to believe them. Eleanor did not answer right away. She lifted the watch, closed it with a soft click, and held it in her palm, her thumb resting along the edge as if she had memorized every line of it. "It changes enough," she said finally. Outside, voices drifted faintly from the street, two men arguing over the price of feed, their words sharp, then fading, replaced by the distant rhythm of a hammer striking wood somewhere down the road, steady, patient, like something being built one careful piece at a time. Caleb glanced again toward the door, noticing for the first time that it had not been fully shut behind him, a thin line of daylight cutting across the floorboards, bright and narrow, like a boundary he had stepped over without thinking. "You have no witnesses," he said, turning back to her, the edge creeping back into his voice, though it did not carry the same strength as before. "No one is going to stand up for a story built on grief and guesses." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a person studies weather, not with fear, but with patience, waiting to see which way it will turn. "People already know," she said. Caleb let out a short breath that might have been a laugh on another day, but it fell flat in the room. "If they knew anything, I would have heard it." Eleanor's eyes did not move. "You did," she said. "You just called it something else." The words landed quiet, but they settled deep, and Caleb felt it. That subtle shift where doubt begins to replace certainty, not loud, not sudden, just enough to make a man question the ground under his boots. He reached for his hat, lifted it slightly, then set it back down again without putting it on, the gesture unfinished, like he was not sure if he was leaving or staying. "You are alone out here," he said. And this time there was something different beneath the words. Not quite a threat, not quite a warning, something closer to recognition. That kind of silence can swallow a person whole. Eleanor looked at the watch in her hand, then back at him, and for the first time, her voice softened, not in weakness, but in certainty. "Silence only swallows what is afraid to be heard," she said. The hammering outside stopped. The voices were gone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath for a moment. And in that stillness, Caleb realized something he had not considered when he rode into town that morning, something that did not fit into any deal he had ever made, something that could not be counted, traded, or buried. This was not about convincing her anymore. This was about something already moving beyond this room, beyond the gold, beyond him. He picked up the pouch at last, but it felt lighter now, like the weight had shifted somewhere else, somewhere he could not reach. And as he stepped back toward the door, that narrow line of sunlight widened just enough to show the dust in the air, drifting slow, steady, carrying with it the quiet sense that Dry Creek was beginning to notice what he had hoped it never would. Caleb stepped out into the light, and the town did not move the way it usually did around him. No quick nods, no easy smiles, just a pause that lingered a second too long, like Dry Creek itself was listening to something it could not quite hear yet. And that was enough to make the air feel different. He adjusted his coat, settling the pouch back inside like it still meant something. But the weight against his chest no longer felt like control, more like a reminder that something had shifted where he could not see it. Across the street, old Mr. Danner leaned against a post outside the general store, chewing slow, eyes following Caleb without looking like he was watching. And that kind of looking was worse than any question spoken out loud. A wagon stood half-loaded near the well, its driver frozen mid-task, rope hanging loose in his hands as if he had forgotten what he was tying down, and even the horses seemed quieter, ears twitching at sounds that had not yet reached them. Caleb moved forward, boots striking the boards with steady rhythm, the same rhythm that had always cleared a path, but today it only echoed, louder than it should have, each step carrying farther than he intended. He reached the center of the street and stopped, just for a moment, as if deciding where to go next. Though a man like him usually did not need to think about direction, he made direction follow him. The saloon doors across from him swayed slightly in the heat, and from inside came the low murmur of voices cut short, then rising again in softer tones, like a conversation folding itself in half the moment his name passed through it. He did not go in. Not yet. Instead, he turned his head back toward Eleanor's house, just enough to see the edge of the porch through the dust, that same still chair, that same quiet window, and for a second, he imagined her still sitting there, watch in hand, not waiting, not chasing, just letting time move the way it always had, steady, patient, certain. Caleb drew a slow breath, then another, as if he could measure what was happening by the way the air felt in his lungs, but it did not settle. It stayed uneven, like something inside him had lost its place. "It is nothing," he muttered under his breath, the words meant to close a door that would not stay shut, and he started walking again, this time toward the courthouse at the far end of the street, where records lived and stories were written in ink instead of whispers. The building stood taller than the rest, its steps worn smooth by years of boots, its flag hanging still in the heat, and as Caleb climbed those steps, he felt the weight of each one, not in his legs, but somewhere deeper, where decisions sit long after they are made. Inside, the air was cooler, dimmer, the smell of paper and dust replacing the sharp dryness outside. And behind the counter, Clerk Harlan looked up, pen pausing mid-stroke, his expression careful, neutral in the way of a man who had learned to keep his thoughts behind his teeth. "Mr. Whitmore," Harlan said, voice even, though it carried a slight hesitation, barely there, but enough. Caleb nodded once, removing his hat, holding it at his side, a habit more than a gesture, and for a second, he stood there without speaking, the silence stretching again, familiar now, but no easier. Then he stepped forward, placing the hat on the counter, fingers lingering on the brim as if anchoring himself. "I need to review the mine records," he said, and though his voice was steady, it no longer filled the room the way it once had. It settled into it, like something that had learned it was not alone anymore. Harlan blinked once, slow, then nodded, turning toward the shelves behind him where ledgers lined up in neat rows, each one holding a piece of the town that no one ever truly forgot. As the clerk reached for a book near the top, the wooden ladder creaked under his weight, and Caleb watched, eyes fixed not on the man, but on the rows of names waiting to be opened, waiting to be read, and for the first time, he realized that whatever Eleanor had started in that small house was not going to stay there. It was already moving, already finding its way into places he had always believed he controlled. And out here, once something started moving like that, it did not stop just because someone wanted it to. The ledger landed on the counter with a dull weight, heavier than its pages should have allowed, and when Clerk Harlan opened it, the sound of paper against paper carried through the room like something being uncovered that had not been meant for light. Caleb stepped closer, resting his hand beside the book, not touching it yet, just feeling its presence, the faint scent of ink and age rising from its pages, steady and unchanging, unlike everything else that had shifted since morning. "Which date?" Harlan asked quietly, his finger already tracing down columns of names and numbers written in careful script, each line a record of something that had once been spoken out loud and then sealed away. Caleb hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough to be noticed, enough for the silence to lean in. 6 months back, he said, his voice lower now, measured in a different way, as if each word needed to be placed exactly right. Harlan nodded, turning pages with practiced ease, the soft flipping marking time more precisely than any clock, until he stopped, finger pressing lightly against a line halfway down. "There," he said. Caleb leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read the entry. The ink still sharp, the letters clean, nothing smudged, nothing uncertain, just a name, a date, and a note written in the same steady hand as the rest. Accident. The word sat there, simple, final, the kind of word that ended questions before they began. Caleb straightened slightly, a faint breath leaving him, something like relief brushing the edge of his expression, but it did not settle, it did not stay. "That is what I told you," he said, more to the room than to Harlan, as if saying it again could fix something that had begun to loosen. Harlan did not answer right away. His finger remained on the page, just above the word, not pointing, not accusing, just resting there like it had not finished its work. "That is what is written," he said finally, careful, precise. Caleb's jaw tightened a fraction. "It is the same thing." Harlan looked up then, meeting his eyes, not with defiance, not with agreement, just with the kind of quiet that made a man hear his own thoughts a little clearer than he might want to. "Not always," he said. The room seemed to hold that difference between what was written and what was true, stretching it thin, making it impossible to ignore. Caleb reached out at last, placing his hand on the page, his fingers brushing the ink lightly, as if he could feel something beneath it, something hidden in the strokes that had not been meant to carry more than one meaning. "Who signed this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, the question coming out slower than it should have. Harlan turned the ledger slightly, revealing the name at the bottom, the signature firm, practiced, the same hand that had written the rest. "Sheriff Brennan." Caleb stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, but the stillness in him had changed, no longer the stillness of control, but the stillness of something calculating, something adjusting to a new shape it had not expected to take. "Anyone else present?" he asked, his voice steady again, but different, like it had found a new edge. Harlan shook his head once. "Not recorded." Caleb let his hand lift from the page, the absence of contact leaving a faint mark where his fingers had rested, a smudge that did not erase the word but blurred it just enough to remind him how easily things could shift. "Records can be corrected," he said, almost casually, though there was nothing casual about the way he said it. Harlan closed the ledger halfway, not fully, just enough to break the line of sight between Caleb and the page. "They can also be read again," he replied. Outside, a gust of wind struck the side of the building, rattling the window panes, and for a moment, the sound filled the space where words had been, a reminder that beyond these walls, the town was still there, still watching, still waiting for something to take shape. Caleb picked up his hat, holding it in both hands now, not wearing it yet, his fingers tightening slightly along the brim. "Keep this open," he said, nodding toward the ledger, his tone returning to something closer to command, but not quite the same as before. Harlan did not move immediately, just looked at the book, then at Caleb, then back again, as if measuring more than the request itself. "It was never closed," he said quietly. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of the courthouse with ink, paper, and a single word that refused to stay simple, Caleb Whitmore understood that what he had come here to confirm had instead begun to unravel, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, precise ways that no amount of gold could gather back together once they had come apart. Caleb stepped out of the courthouse with the ledger's weight still pressing against his thoughts, though he had not carried it with him, and the daylight felt sharper now, like it was cutting through something that used to sit comfortably in shadow, and for the first time in years, the street did not feel like something he could cross without consequence. The boards beneath his boots answered each step with a hollow sound, not loud, not accusing, just present in a way that made silence harder to ignore. He placed his hat back on his head, pulling the brim low, not to hide, but to steady himself, as if the gesture could restore something that had begun to slip. Across the way, the saloon door stood half open, and the murmur inside shifted as he approached, voices lowering just enough to be noticed, glasses set down a little softer than usual, like the room itself had learned a new kind of caution. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside, the smell of wood, tobacco, and stale beer wrapping around him in something familiar, something that had always held steady no matter what the outside world did. But today, even that felt thinner. Men at the tables looked up, then back down, not out of fear, not exactly, but out of something closer to awareness, like they were all holding the same thought and waiting to see who would say it first. Caleb moved to the bar, resting his hand on the worn edge, the grooves in the wood fitting his palm like they always had, a small, steady thing in a day that had begun to lose its shape. "Whiskey," he said, and the bartender nodded, already reaching for the bottle, pouring slow, the amber liquid catching the light before settling into the glass with a quiet certainty that everything else seemed to lack. Caleb did not drink right away. He let the glass sit in front of him, watching the surface ripple once, then go still, and in that stillness, he saw his own reflection, faint, distorted, not quite what it had been when the morning started. "Busy day," someone said from the far end of the bar, the voice casual, but placed carefully, like a stone dropped into water to see how far the ripples would go. Caleb did not turn. "Same as any other," he replied, though the words felt thinner than they sounded. A chair scraped lightly behind him, then another, and the quiet in the room shifted, not breaking, just rearranging itself. "Heard Eleanor Hayes had a visitor," another voice added, softer, but closer this time. Caleb lifted the glass, took a slow drink, letting the burn settle in his chest, grounding him in something he understood, something that followed rules he could rely on. "People hear a lot of things," he said, setting the glass down with more care than necessary. No one answered right away, but the silence that followed was not empty. It carried something, a shared understanding that had not been there before, and Caleb could feel it moving through the room the same way it had begun to move through the town. Quiet, steady, impossible to stop once it found its path. He turned then, finally, letting his eyes sweep across the faces behind him, men he had known for years, men who had nodded when he spoke, who had followed when he led, and now they met his gaze differently, not challenging, not submissive, just watching, waiting, as if measuring something they had never needed to measure before. Caleb held their eyes for a moment, then another, and something in him settled, not back into place, but into a new position, one that required less certainty and more awareness. He reached into his coat, felt the pouch still there, untouched, and for a second, his fingers tightened around it, as if considering one more attempt, one more solution that had always worked before. Then he let it go. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the saloon doors, sending a brief gust of dust across the threshold. And in that moment, Caleb Whitmore understood that this was no longer a matter of one house, one ledger, or one conversation. It had spread, and once something like that found its way into a town like Dry Creek, it did not need to be shouted. It only needed to be seen. The glass in front of Caleb remained half full, untouched now, the surface catching a thin line of light from the window, as if time itself had slowed just enough to make every second feel deliberate. And around him the saloon no longer felt like a place of noise and escape, but a room holding its breath. A man near the card table shifted in his seat, the scrape of wood against floor echoing louder than it should have, and another followed, not standing, not leaving, just adjusting as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived but was already expected. Caleb rested both hands on the bar, fingers spread, grounding himself in the worn grain beneath his palms, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in weakness, but in calculation, the kind that had guided him through years of decisions made without hesitation. When he opened them again, the room had not changed, but the way it looked at him had. "Where is Brennan?" he asked, voice even, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without forcing it. The bartender paused, cloth in hand, eyes flicking once toward the door before returning to the glass he was cleaning. "Has not been in today," he said. Caleb nodded slowly, as if that answer had been expected, though it did not settle anything. "He should be," Caleb replied, softer now, almost to himself, like a man noting something out of place in a pattern he had always trusted. No one answered. The quiet stretched again, but this time it carried weight, a shared awareness that the absence of one man had begun to matter more than his presence ever had. Caleb reached for his drink, lifted it, then set it back down without taking a sip, the motion incomplete, like a thought that refused to finish forming. He turned away from the bar, scanning the room. Once more, and this time he saw it clearly, not fear, not defiance, something else, something steadier, like the ground beneath a storm that refuses to move no matter how hard the wind pushes. "If anyone has something to say," he began, his voice firm again, reclaiming some of its old edge, "now would be the time." The words settled into the room, but they did not stir it, did not break the silence the way they once would have, and that silence answered him more honestly than any voice could have. No one spoke, not because they were afraid, but because they were no longer required to. Caleb held that moment, felt it press against him, and for the first time, he understood that control was not something you could demand once it had slipped away. It was something given, and once withheld, it did not return the same way. A chair creaked again, softer this time, and an older man near the window lifted his eyes just enough to meet Caleb's gaze, then lowered them again, not in submission, but in quiet decision. That was when Caleb turned toward the door. He pushed it open without force, letting the sunlight spill in, bright and unforgiving, and stepped out onto the street where the wind had begun to rise again, carrying dust in slow spirals that moved across the ground like something searching for direction. He paused there, just outside the threshold, and looked down the road toward the far edge of town, where the sheriff's office stood with its door closed and its windows dark, and beyond that, farther still, the line of hills that marked where the mine lay, silent now, but not forgotten. Caleb adjusted his hat once more, pulling it low, then began to walk, not toward the courthouse, not back to Eleanor's house, but down the long stretch of road that connected them both, each step measured, each one carrying him deeper into something he could no longer step around. And behind him, inside the saloon, the silence remained, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like a verdict that did not need to be spoken out loud for everyone to understand it had already begun. The road stretched ahead of Caleb like a line drawn too straight to ignore, dust lifting under each step of his boots, slow and deliberate, the kind of pace a man keeps when he is no longer chasing anything, but also not running from it. And the farther he moved from the center of Dry Creek, the quieter the town seemed behind him, not because it had stopped watching, but because it had already seen enough. The sheriff's office stood ahead, small against the wide sky, its wooden sign creaking lightly as the wind shifted direction, the door still closed, still holding whatever silence Brennan had chosen to keep for himself. Caleb slowed as he reached the steps, his hand hovering near the railing before resting on it, the wood warm from the sun, solid, unchanged, unlike everything else that had begun to move around him. He stood there for a moment, looking at the door, not knocking, not calling out, just measuring the space between what he knew and what he had chosen not to question until now. Inside, there was no movement, no shadow crossing the narrow gap beneath the door, nothing to suggest the man who had signed that ledger was anywhere within reach. Caleb exhaled, long and steady, then turned slightly, his gaze drifting past the office toward the distant ridge where the mine sat carved into the earth, silent but present, like a truth waiting to be spoken in its own time. A faint sound carried on the wind, Not voices, not footsteps, something softer, like metal brushing against metal, and he followed it without thinking, stepping off the porch and moving along the side of the building toward the narrow alley that ran behind it. The space there was tight, shadowed, the sun barely touching the ground, and as he rounded the corner, he saw it. A horse tied loosely to the back post, reins hanging slack, saddle still in place. Dust settled along its flanks as if it had been standing there longer than it should have. Caleb approached slowly, his eyes scanning the ground. The marks left in the dirt, not disturbed, not hurried, just there, quiet, like everything else in this town that had begun to reveal itself in pieces rather than answers. He reached out, resting a hand briefly against the horse's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm, something alive, something certain in a day that had offered very little of either. Then he looked toward the back door of the office, slightly ajar, just enough to show a thin line of darkness beyond it. And for a moment, he did not move, as if he understood that stepping through that space would not bring clarity, only more of what had already begun to unfold. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faintest trace of dust, and something else, something older, like the earth itself remembering what had been taken from it. And Caleb straightened, his hand falling away from the horse as his eyes fixed on that open door. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply stepped forward, crossing that narrow threshold into a place where silence did not hide anything anymore. It only waited for someone to listen closely enough to hear what had always been there. And as he moved into the shadow, leaving the light behind him, it became clear that whatever he had come to find was no longer something he could choose to see or ignore. It was already part of him now, moving step by step, just like he was, toward a truth that would not stay buried no matter how deep it had been written down. The air inside the back room carried a stillness that felt older than the building itself, the kind that did not come from emptiness but from things left unsaid. And as Caleb stepped fully inside, the door behind him moved slightly on its hinge, closing just enough to dim the light without sealing it out completely. Dust hung in the narrow beam that slipped through the gap, drifting slow, almost deliberate, like it had nowhere else to go. And for a moment Caleb did not move, letting his eyes adjust, letting the shape of the room come into focus piece by piece. A desk stood against the far wall, papers stacked in uneven piles, a chair pulled back at an angle that suggested it had been left in a hurry or perhaps never meant to be returned to. And on the surface of the desk lay a single sheet set apart from the rest, its edges too clean to belong to the clutter around it. Caleb stepped forward, each footfall measured, the wooden floor answering with a muted creak that seemed louder. In the quiet, and as he reached the desk, his gaze fixed on that page, the way a man looks at something he already knows will change what comes next. He did not touch it right away. Instead, he looked around the room once more, noting the small details that had gone unnoticed before, the window half covered, the shelf missing one ledger from a row that otherwise remained undisturbed, the faint mark along the wall where something had once hung and no longer did. Then he reached out and lifted the page, holding it between his fingers, the paper lighter than it should have felt, as if its weight had already been carried elsewhere. The handwriting was familiar, the same steady lines he had seen in the courthouse, the same careful strokes that turned events into records and records into something people stopped questioning. But this was not a ledger entry. This was not meant for the shelf. It was shorter, direct, written with a purpose that did not leave room for interpretation. Caleb read it once, then again, slower the second time, each word settling into him in a way that made the room feel even smaller. There were no names spelled out completely, only initials, enough to be understood by the one who wrote it and the one it was meant for. And among those marks, one stood out, a set of letters carved deeper into the page, pressed harder than the rest, as if the hand that wrote them had hesitated, then committed fully. Caleb's jaw tightened, not in surprise, but in recognition of something that had already begun to take shape long before he stepped into this room. He lowered the paper slightly, his eyes shifting toward the door, then back again, as if measuring how far this had spread and how little of it he could still control. Outside, a faint sound reached him, not clear, not defined, just the presence of movement somewhere beyond the walls, and it carried the same quiet certainty that had followed him all day, the the sense that Dry Creek was no longer waiting for permission to see what had been hidden. Caleb folded the paper once, careful, precise, then placed it back where he had found it, aligning it exactly as it had been, as if restoring order could undo what it contained. But the room did not return to what it had been. The silence remained, heavier now, filled with the knowledge that something written in private had already begun to find its way into the open. Caleb stepped back, his hand brushing against the edge of the desk, steadying himself for a moment he did not fully understand, then turned toward the door, the narrow line of light waiting there like a boundary he would have to cross again, knowing that whatever he carried with him now was not something that could be left behind, not in this room, not in this town, not anymore. When Caleb stepped back into the light, it no longer felt like something that belonged to him. It felt like something that revealed him, and for a brief moment he stood there at the edge of the sheriff's office, 1 foot in shadow, 1 foot in sun, as if the town itself had drawn a line he had not seen before. The wind had shifted again, carrying voices now, not loud, not direct, just fragments drifting through the air like pieces of a conversation already underway, and as he moved forward onto the street, those fragments began to take shape. People were not hiding their glances anymore. They were holding them. Not long, not confrontational, just steady enough to say they were no longer looking away. Caleb walked past the well, past the general store, each step slower than the last, not because he was unsure where he was going, but because he was beginning to understand that where he was going might not matter as much as how he got there. A group had gathered near the courthouse steps, not a crowd, not yet, but enough to change the rhythm of the place, enough to shift the balance that had once kept everything quiet and predictable. Clerk Harlan stood among them, the ledger from earlier now in his hands, open, not hidden, and beside him, old Mr. Danner leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in focus, as if he was seeing something clearly for the first time in a long while. Caleb slowed as he approached, his gaze moving from face to face, recognizing each one, noting the difference, the absence of that small, automatic deference that had once followed him like a shadow. Something you need, Caleb said, his voice steady, but it did not carry the same weight it once had. It settled into the space instead of filling it. Harlan looked up, not startled, not defensive, just aware. "We are reading," he said, lifting the ledger slightly, not as a challenge, but as a fact. Caleb's eyes flicked to the page, then back to Harlan, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing simple left to say. "Records are not rumors," Harlan added, his tone even, but firm in a way that did not ask for permission. A murmur moved through the small group, quiet, but connected, like a current passing from one person to the next. Caleb shifted his stance, the dust beneath his boots settling in a thin cloud around him, and he felt it then, not fear, not yet, something closer to recognition, the understanding that this was no longer a conversation he could control by choosing when to speak. "And records can be wrong," Caleb replied, but the words did not land the way they were meant to. They hung in the air, lighter than before, easier to question. Danner spoke then, his voice slow, worn by years, but clear. "Then we read them again," he said, "and we listen." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, held in place by people who had decided, one by one, to stop letting it pass them by. Caleb looked at them, really looked this time, and what he saw was not opposition, not accusation, but something harder to move, something that did not bend just because he had always expected it to. He reached up, adjusting his hat, though it no longer felt like something that settled him, and his eyes drifted, almost without intention, back down the road toward Eleanor's house, that quiet place at the edge of town where this had begun. And in that moment, standing in the open with the ledger no longer hidden and the town no longer silent, Caleb Whitmore understood that the truth he had tried to contain had already stepped out into the light, and now it was no longer his to shape, only his to face. The ledger remained open between them, its pages unmoving in the dry air, but something in the crowd had shifted from curiosity into something firmer, something that no longer asked permission to exist, and Caleb could feel it settling around him like the dust that never truly left this town. He did not step back. He did not step forward. He stood there, measuring the distance between himself and the people who had once followed his lead without question, And for the first time, that distance felt uncertain. Harlan turned a page slowly, the sound deliberate, drawing every eye not just to the ink, but to the act itself, as if reading had become something more than habit, something closer to choice. There are gaps, Harlan said, his voice steady, not raised, but carrying farther than before, because now people were listening for it. Dates that do not match. Entries that end where they should not. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He could have. Once he would have. But now the moment did not belong to him alone, and he knew it. And signatures, Danner added, leaning in just enough to see the page more clearly, that looked the same even when they should not. A murmur followed that, softer than before, but deeper, like something taking root. Caleb lifted his chin slightly, his eyes moving from one face to another, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything he could still turn in his favor, but what he found instead was something quieter and more difficult to move, a kind of agreement that had formed without needing to be spoken out loud. "You are reading pieces," Caleb said, his voice calm, controlled, but it no longer carried the weight of certainty. It sounded like a man placing his words carefully, hoping they would hold. Without the whole, they mean nothing. Harlan looked up again, meeting his gaze, not challenging it, but not stepping away either. "Then we will find the whole," he replied. The words did not rise. They did not push. They simply settled, and that made them harder to dismiss. Caleb felt it then, that subtle shift where control does not break, but slips, one small piece at a time, until it is no longer something you hold, but something you remember having. He adjusted his stance, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his eyes, and for a brief moment, he considered reaching into his coat, feeling the pouch still there, the gold still untouched, the solution that had always worked before. But he did not move, because something in the air had changed, something that made that old solution feel smaller than it had ever been. A woman at the edge of the group stepped forward slightly, not enough to take the center, just enough to be seen, her voice quiet but clear. "She did not take it," she said. "No name. No explanation. None needed." The words moved through the crowd, not as noise, but as recognition, and Caleb felt them land in a place deeper than the ledger, deeper than the paper he had seen in the back room. He turned his head then, slowly, his eyes following the road again, back toward that small house at the edge of town, where a woman sat with nothing but a watch and the truth she had refused to sell. And in that moment, standing in front of a town that had begun to read instead of look away, Caleb Whitmore understood that what he was facing was not a single accusation, not a single record, but something larger, something built from quiet decisions made one by one, until they became something no man could buy his way out of. The wind moved again, brushing past the group, lifting the edge of the ledger page before letting it fall back into place, and no one reached to close it. The wind did not stop, but it softened, as if the town itself had decided not to rush what was already unfolding, and Caleb stood there with the weight of every eye no longer pressing him down, but holding him in place, steady, unblinking, like something that had finally settled into its true shape. No one stepped forward to accuse him. No one raised a voice. The ledger stayed open, the pages quiet, but alive with everything they carried. And for the first time, Caleb understood that this kind of moment did not need noise to be final. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes the road he thought he controlled had been turning long before he noticed. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, not forced, not commanding, just present. "You want the whole story," he said, not looking at Harlan, not looking at Danner, but somewhere past them, toward the line where the town met the open land. No one answered, but no one turned away either. That was answer enough. Caleb reached up and removed his hat, holding it in both hands now, the brim turning slightly between his fingers, a habit that no longer carried authority, only thought. The mind was failing, he continued, each word placed carefully, not to persuade, but because it had to be said. Costs were rising. Pressure was building. Men were talking about closing it down. He paused, not because he had run out of words, but because he was choosing which ones to keep and which ones to leave behind. "Your husband," he said, his voice shifting just slightly as he turned his head toward the road that led to Eleanor's house. He found something in those tunnels. Not gold, not silver, something wrong in the structure. something that should have stopped everything. The wind moved again, brushing across the group, lifting the edges of coats and hats, carrying the sound of his voice just far enough that it felt like the whole town could hear it, even those not standing there. He wanted it written down, Caleb went on. Wanted it reported. Said it would cost lives if it stayed hidden. A silence followed that was deeper than any before, not empty, but filled with the weight of what had just been placed into it. Caleb's grip on his hat tightened slightly, then eased. And I made a decision, he said. No defense. No explanation wrapped around it. Just the words, simple, direct. I told Brennan to keep the record clean, to call it something else, to keep the mine open. No one moved. Not a step, not a breath out of place. But something changed, something that did not need to be seen to be understood. Caleb looked down briefly, then back up, his eyes passing over the faces again. But this time he did not search for doubt or support. He simply saw them. I told myself it was business, he added quieter now. Told myself it was temporary, that it would hold until things settled. He let the words rest there, not asking for belief, not expecting it. The truth did not need to be accepted to exist. It only needed to be spoken. A long moment passed, the kind that stretches without breaking, and in that stillness, the town did not react the way it once might have. No one rushed. No one scattered. They stayed. They listened. And that was something Caleb had not prepared for. He lifted his hat slightly, then lowered it again, not placing it back on his head, just holding it, as if he was not yet ready to carry anything else. His eyes moved once more toward Eleanor's house, that quiet place at the edge of everything. And for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no plan forming behind it, only recognition. And standing there, with the truth no longer hidden behind paper or gold, Caleb Whitmore understood that what came next would not be decided by him. And for the first time in a long time, he did not try to change that. No one moved to stop him. And that was the part Caleb felt the most, not resistance, not anger, just the absence of anything that once would have shielded him. And as the silence settled after his words, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like something being placed exactly where it belonged. Harlan closed the ledger slowly, not to hide it, but to mark the moment, the soft thud of the cover carrying farther than it should have, and Danner straightened beside him, his gaze drifting past Caleb toward the far edge of town, where the small house stood alone against the open land. No one gave an order. No one declared what should happen next. The town did not need it. One by one, people stepped back, not away from the truth, but into it, making space for what came after, and Caleb remained where he was, hat still in his hands, the weight of it no longer something he could set aside. He turned then, not quickly, not with purpose, just a quiet shift, his boots finding the road again without being told where to go, and the path led him the same way it had all day, toward that place at the edge where this had begun. The walk felt longer now, though the distance had not changed, each step carrying something he had not carried before, something that did not press down, but settled in, steady and certain. The town behind him did not call out. It did not follow. It watched, not to judge, not to intervene, but to witness, and that was enough. When he reached the porch, the boards creaked the same way they always had, familiar, unchanged, and for a moment he stood there, looking at the door he had opened without asking that morning, the memory of it sharp in a way that made the present feel quieter. He did not push it open this time. He knocked. Once. The sound was soft, but it carried, and after a moment, the door opened just enough for Eleanor to stand there, the light behind her outlining a figure that had not moved from what it was, only become clearer. She looked at him the same way she had before, steady, without fear, without surprise, and Caleb did not reach into his coat, did not offer anything, did not explain. He simply stood there, hat in his hands, the words he had used all his life no longer fitting the space between them. "It is written now," he said, and even that felt like more than it needed to be. Eleanor's eyes held his for a moment, then shifted past him, toward the road, toward the town that had begun to listen instead of turn away, and when she looked back, there was no triumph in her expression, no victory, just a quiet understanding that something had returned to where it belonged. She stepped aside, not inviting him in, not closing the door, just leaving the space open, and Caleb did not move forward. He remained on the porch, the threshold between them clear, not as a barrier, but as a line neither of them needed to cross. The wind moved lightly through the yard, stirring the dust in slow patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood again, steady, patient, the sound of something being rebuilt one piece at a time. Caleb lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not searching now, not measuring, just seeing, and after a moment, he placed his hat back on his head, the gesture simple, without weight. He stepped back from the door, not in retreat, but in recognition, and turned toward the road once more, leaving the space as he had found it, quiet, unchanged in its form, but different in what it carried. Eleanor remained in the doorway, watching not him, but the line of the horizon beyond him, and as Caleb walked away, the town did not need to speak, did not need to act, because out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It settled in the stillness between people, in the choices they made when no one told them what to do. And in the end, it was not the gold that stayed, not the records, not even the words, but the moment a man stood with nothing left to say and understood that it was enough.